October 1347. The port of Messina, Sicily. 12 Genoese merchant ships drift into the harbor. The dock workers approach the water, but the vessels arrive in total, unnatural silence. On the decks, the sailors are either dead or barely breathing. Their skin is blackened. Swellings the size of eggs bulge from their necks and groins, weeping dark fluid. The harbor master issues an immediate order: push the ships back out to sea. But the panicked authorities are focused on the dying men, entirely missing the rats moving through the darkness of the cargo holds. A harbor relies on walls, chains, and guards to keep out naval sleets. Those defenses offer zero physical resistance to a biological infiltration. By the time the ships are forced away, the threat is already on shore. Humanity's first line of defense collapsed before anyone understood an attack was underway. A stone wall cannot hold back an invisible enemy. The invasion did not start in the Mediterranean. To find the source, we have to look years earlier, deep inside the Central Asian steppe. Archaeological excavations near Issyk-Kul, in modern-day Kyrgyzstan, reveal a sudden, massive cluster of graves dating to 1338 and 1339. The headstones describe an unknown pestilence sweeping through the local population. The culprit was a microscopic, rod-shaped bacterium known today as Yersinia pestis. The bacteria survived and multiplied inside the gut of the flea. When the flea swallowed the blood of a host, it transmitted the bacteria back into the bloodstream, and these fleas fed heavily on black rats. The Mongol Empire had stitched the Eurasian continent together. Rats nested in grain sacks and cargo holds, moving seamlessly from the steppe along the established trade routes directly toward the Black Sea port of Kaffa. By the end of 1347, the disease consumed Sicily and crossed to the Italian mainland. Venice, the wealthiest maritime power in Europe, barred ships from infected regions. The disease bypassed the naval blockades and infiltrated the city anyway. In the summer of 1348, the writer Giovanni Boccaccio watched Florence disintegrate from his window. He documented a city where the social contract dissolved entirely. Parents abandoned their sick children, and neighbors barricaded their doors against neighbors. The volume of casualties overwhelmed the physical infrastructure. Corpses piled up in the streets because the living were too decimated to operate the burial carts. The plague eradicated the population while simultaneously destroying the core moral obligations that allowed human civilization to function. The medical establishment of 1348 had no concept of germ theory. The prevailing consensus was miasma, that corrupt air and planetary alignments caused illness. Physicians stuffed the beak of their masks with herbs, hoping to filter out the poisoned atmosphere. They prescribed treatments aligned with this flawed logic. They drained blood from patients and strapped live chickens to the weeping swellings, inflicting agony while achieving nothing. The Pope's personal physician, Guy de Chauliac, eventually recorded a bleak truth. The medical profession was completely helpless. Humanity attempted to fight a highly evolved biological pathogen using astrological charts and superstition. Every institution designed to heal the sick was guaranteed to fail. Moving north like a weather system, the disease overtook Paris by June. In the summer of 1348, it crossed the Channel and made landfall in Dorset, spreading rapidly onto the unprotected British Isles. The rural infrastructure collapsed just as fast as the urban centers. Chroniclers recorded entire farming settlements falling completely silent, with grass growing high over doorways where no living person had walked in months. Without human labor, the agricultural economy froze. Flocks of sheep and cattle wandered aimlessly through overgrown fields, dying and rotting where they stood because there were no hands left to herd them or harvest the meat. Whether sweeping through a densely packed trading hub or a remote pastoral village, the geography of collapse was inescapable. By the end of 1349, the aggregate math of the catastrophe defied human comprehension. An estimated 25 to 30 million people across Europe were dead. This chart visualizes the scale of the void. Before the ships arrived, medieval Europe sustained a population of approximately 75 million. In barely 2 years, that number dropped to roughly 45 million. In enclosed communities like monasteries, where proximity accelerated the spread of the pneumonic strain, the death rate reached an absolute 100%. Entire congregations were laid side by side in trenches of lime. But beyond the endless fields of newly dug graves, the horizon stretches north towards Scandinavia, Poland, and Russia. In those untouched territories, the autumn harvests are still being gathered. The populations there are praying for the victims in the south, completely unaware of the invisible tide advancing up the continent. The pestilence had fractured the medieval world and erased tens of millions of lives. But as 1349 drew to a close, the killing machine had not yet finished its work. In the summer of 1349, an English wool ship docked in the bustling harbor of Bergen, Norway. It brought highly sought-after trade goods, but as the dockworkers unloaded the cargo, they began dropping where they stood. The plague had reached Scandinavia. Bergen's waterfront was a thriving maritime hub. Those tightly packed wooden storehouses and deep-water docks made it the perfect entry point for the pathogen to establish a beachhead and push deep into the northern wilderness. Once the disease moved inland, the landscape went completely silent. By the time winter arrived, remote farmhouses stood frozen and empty. The snow drifted through open doorways to cover tables where entire families sat dead, untouched by a single living neighbor. This map visualizes the legal geography of the northern spread. As the contagion swept through Norway, Sweden, and eventually Iceland, it stripped the land of its people. In many specific communities, the mortality rate rapidly exceeded 60%. The death toll was so absolute that the Norwegian language adopted a specific word, "ude," meaning abandoned, to describe the thousands of agricultural settlements left permanently empty. Many of these remote farms would not see human habitation for 2 centuries. A medieval society built on manual labor and close-knit agrarian communities cannot absorb that level of sudden emptiness. The North was physically depopulated, well past the point of basic function. 14th century medicine had no concept of bacteria or germ theory. Faced with an invisible pathogen that slaughtered the healthy alongside the sick, the surviving population snapped. They needed an explanation for the dying, and they looked upward. Thousands of men joined the flagellant movement, marching in massive processions through the streets of Germany and the Low Countries. Convinced the Black Death was a divine punishment, they publicly whipped themselves. They tore their own flesh to atone for humanity's sins before God could wipe out the rest of them. But self-inflicted pain did not stop the dying. The extreme religious terror quickly warped into a desperate search for earthly scapegoats. In February 1349, the citizens of Strasbourg rounded up the city's Jewish population, baselessly accusing them of poisoning the local wells. Without a shred of evidence, the mob herded 2,000 men, women, and children into the local cemetery and burned them alive. The absolute incomprehensibility of the disease drove desperate communities to invent enemies they could actually see, adding thousands of self-inflicted murders to a death toll that already defied mathematics. Above the panicked streets sat the ultimate authority of the medieval era, the Catholic Church. It kept the records, directed the laws, and held a total monopoly on spiritual salvation. Yet the papacy was as helpless as the peasantry. As the disease shredded the papal court in Avignon, Pope Clement VI locked himself inside his private chambers. On the advice of his remaining physicians, he sat entirely alone between 2 roaring fires, hoping the extreme heat would purify the poisoned air. Behind those walls, the Pope survived, but the physical fortress could not protect the wider institution. Out in the parishes, the religious infrastructure collapsed entirely. Parish priests died at massive rates because their duties required them to attend the sick. Monasteries emptied. Across half the continent, the dead were buried in mass trenches without last rites, severing the final required link between a medieval soul and heaven. The Church failed to provide physical safety, and it failed to provide a theological answer for why God permitted the slaughter. That twin failure permanently cracked the absolute authority the institution held over the European mind. By 1350, the acute phase of the initial outbreak receded. The survivors walked out of their homes into an eerie, quiet landscape where empty fields and vacant properties stretched for miles. In the feudal system, land was the ultimate wealth, and human labor was cheap. The plague violently flipped that equation. With up to half the workforce dead, the few surviving peasants realized they had leverage. For the first time in generations, they could refuse to work a lord's estate unless they were paid actual wages. The nobility tried to artificially cap wages by passing strict laws like the English Statute of Laborers. The legislation failed entirely. Laborers simply walked away to find better offers, sparking organized uprisings like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, led by figures like John Ball. By stripping away the surplus population, the pathogen accidentally triggered a massive redistribution of wealth downward, breaking the economic stranglehold of the ruling class. The scars of that rupture are still etched into the physical geography. Archaeologists have mapped more than 3,000 abandoned ghost villages in England alone, settlements that thrived in 1340 and simply ceased to exist by 1350. The legacy is also written into human DNA. The survivors were not a random sample. They possessed specific immune system variants that are now deeply overrepresented in modern European genetics. Culturally, artists abandoned the rigid, orderly depictions of feudal hierarchy. The danse macabre motif emerged, displaying kings, popes, and peasants holding hands with mocking skeletons. Mass death proved that earthly status offered zero physical protection. The survivors who inherited the remaining wealth had watched their most sacred institutions fail. That deeply ingrained skepticism created an ideological vacuum, allowing entirely new schools of science, art, and philosophy to take root in the empty spaces. 50 million people died in the span of a few years. The Black Death did not actively build the modern world, but it forcefully dismantled the rigid medieval structures that would never have permitted it to exist.